crazy war in the Ukraine is continuing. I think that'll burn out. There was a possibility, still a possibility, that it might have flared into a nuclear war, and it still might. But the Ukrainians are losing. They're out of money, they're out of men, and the Russians are overwhelming them. And now that Trump is in office, they're not going to be subsidized. We're not going to be spending hundreds of billions of dollars so young Ukrainians can go out and kill young Russians. So that's good news. The other thing that's happened, just about, I think, when we were talking last time, is this dust-up between the Israelis and the Palestinians in Gaza. And that doesn't seem like it's going to end anytime soon, partially because Trump is an ardent supporter of Israel. And that may wind up yet in a nuclear war where the Americans are prodded into attacking the Iranians because Bibi says to. So unpredictable. But problems between the Israelis or the Jews and the Palestinians and the Mohammedans is not going to go away for many reasons. It's going to go on just about forever. Anyway, if Kamala had been installed, it would have been game over for America because the Jacobins who control Washington now still would have cemented themselves in office and done all kinds of crazy Marxist socialist things. And of course, the people voting for Trump would have been ultra pissed off. I've been saying for about 10 years that the U.S. was heading for something resembling a civil war, and it might have broken out. But now that Trump is in office, maybe things are going to calm down, or maybe not. But I'm pretty happy because the important thing is who's got control of the apparatus of the state, which is so powerful. Regarding his previous 4 years in office, Trump showed extraordinarily poor judgment about the people that he invited into his cabinet and other places, like John Bolton, and he was talking to a warmonger, Nikki Haley, another Mike Pompeo. He surrounded by all these neocon warmongers. So it was wonderful what Trump did get done, where he did a lot of deregulation, a huge plus, and he cut the rates of taxation a lot. Wonderful. So that was a mixed bag, but I like to look at the bright side. Now, what's he going to do this time? I think, once again, he's going to cut the marginal rates of taxes. Wonderful. Fantastic. That's going to help the economy. And he's going to redouble his efforts to fire government employees. And he's got Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy that are tasked to doing that. So it looks like morning in America for these reasons. That's the bright side. But there's a downside too. And the problem is that Trump has always been what he calls a low interest rate guy, which is disastrous for lots of reasons. First of all, the government shouldn't adjust interest rates at all. That should be a purely market function. But he's also described himself as the king of debt. Debt is very, very dangerous. What I'm afraid of is that the U.S. government is running a $2 trillion deficit now. Where's the U.S. government get that money to finance this gigantic deficit? 10 times what it was not so long ago. And it needs to do that just to finance its 35 going on $36 trillion of disclosed debt. Not talking about off-budget debt or contingent debt. That's another $150 trillion. Basically, that $2 trillion deficit is paper that's being sold to the U.S. Central Bank, the Federal Reserve. And when they sell that debt to the Fed deposits, let's say, $2 trillion in the U.S. government's accounts at commercial banks, Citibank or Chase or something like that. And then that goes into the economy. So that's the actual engine of inflation, compounded by the fractional reserve system that is going to bankrupt all the U.S. banks. So, answer to the question, inflation is going to get out of control in the U.S. Actions have consequences. You print up lots of money and it goes into the country, inflation will go higher. Some people like it because the people in New York and Washington will get that $2 trillion first at its old value, and they'll get more of it because they're politically connected and they can take advantage of it. So it's a real good news, bad news thing with Trump. Well, let's look at the stock market. It's at bubble levels highs. I mean, the Dow is at all-time highs. The S&P, everything's at all-time highs, okay? Not all stocks, but the stocks in the indexes certainly are, led by the Magnificent Seven, like NVIDIA, with a $3.5 trillion market cap, and some other ones like Microsoft and Google. multi-trillion-dollar market caps. Personally, I don't want any part of the stock market because it's gone up way for a long time, and by all of the conventional historic parameters of what's cheap and what's dear, it's very dear. People forget that there have been times, a number of times, not so long ago, when the average stock yielded something like 7%. Average stock. And many individual stocks that were out of favor, but solid companies, yielded 10 or 12%. Those days are gone. So this is why Warren Buffett is raising hundreds of billions of dollars selling stocks that he's owned for a long time and buying treasury bills. So the stock market's overpriced in general. I don't want any part of it. The bond market was in a bull market from roughly 1982 to 2022. Interest rates went from where the U.S. government was paying 15 to 18%, sounds unbelievable, to borrow money, to close to zero to borrow money. Now they've been going up for the last 2 years. I think they're headed much, much higher, along with inflation. The U.S. government can't control long-term interest rates anyway. So stay out of stocks, with a few exceptions here and there. There are always exceptions. Stay out of all bonds, frankly. They're a triple threat to your capital. You got the interest rate risk, you got the currency risk, because the dollar's in a world of trouble. It's going to go down, 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 reach its intrinsic value. But most people are unaware that the S&P, who rates bonds of governments as well as corporations, the U.S. government has been decreased from a AAA to a AA+, and it's going to get worse. So no stocks, no bonds, and I still like commodities. Commodities relative to everything else are cheap. And gold isn't particularly cheap, but it's going a lot higher. People think it's impossible for the U.S. government to default because they can print up money as much as they want to pay off their debt, to cover their interest rate. Incidentally, the U.S. government is paying over $1 trillion a year right now in interest on its debt alone. And as they roll over their current debt, it's going to be rolled over at much higher interest rates. And as I said, my prediction, for what it's worth, is that interest rates are going much higher in correspondence with inflation. So that $1 trillion in interest by the time Trump is out of office, plus more debt, of course, which has to be paid interest on, it's going to be $2 trillion in interest alone. So why should the government default? It will default eventually. There's two ways it can default. One, the dishonest way, which is printing up money until we get into the situation that Argentina has gotten into. But that's the worst thing that they can do because it impoverishes the average guy who cannot save money. And it's hard because prices go up faster than wages. But if he saves money, it's being inflated away out from under him. And eventually, if the dollar catastrophically loses value, that's going to create chaos in the U.S. When we have a runaway inflation in places like Zimbabwe, it's a horrific disaster. But in the U.S., it would be a double horrific disaster because the whole world uses U.S. dollars. It would create worldwide chaos. Anyway, they keep spending money and financing it. Yeah, sure. They can print up money to pay the debt. That's what'll happen. The other alternative is they don't print up enough money. Then what happens? Well, it becomes a daisy chain where the U.S. government looks like it's going to default, and a lot of banks that are looking to be bailed out, insurance companies, which will be coming up soon, incidentally. So then you have a catastrophic deflation where bonds are defaulted on, stock market crashes. Okay, they don't want that. That sounds like 1929 to them, and they know what happened. 1929, awful. Stop that at any cost. It's inflate or die as far as the U.S. government is concerned. So how does default on the debt work into this? Well, it will default one way or another on the debt because we can't borrow increasing amounts forever for lots of reasons we can talk about. First of all, they should default on the debt because it's immoral. To who? I mean, it's given current people an artificially high standard of living. Just like if you or I borrowed $1 million, we could live high off the hog for the next year until we had to pay it back with interest. But the thing is that it's immoral because the next generation, yet unborn, and their kids are going to be saddled with this debt, and they're going to be turned into indentured servants or serfs to pay it back to somebody that owns it. And I don't think that's right, to indenture your kids so you can live high off the hog. It should be defaulted on for moral reasons, quite frankly. Second reason relating to that is that some people have lent the U.S. government all this debt, all this money, and they have in effect been making possible all the stupid and wasteful and ridiculous things that the government has done, all the graft and corruption, wars and stupidity by lending it money. They should be punished, okay? So that's a second point that I'd make. The third point is that you can look at the debt of the U.S. government as a building 100 stories high, and it's wobbling, and it's about to fall with this huge debt burden. So what do you do when you have a giant skyscraper that's about to collapse? Two things you can do. You can wait and let it collapse randomly, unpredictably, and that's the worst scenario with everybody. You don't know when, you don't know how. The other thing is you have a controlled demolition. And that's what I'm suggesting with the U.S. government debt. I know it's outrageous to say that because the whole world, the whole financial world runs on government debt. But I'm sorry, do it now. They should have done it years ago. And also it would make it impossible or harder for the government to borrow more. If they'd done this 30 years ago, when I first mentioned it, actually, believe it or not, nobody would have been willing to lend the government money because they could see that it was a dangerous risk, like the Argentine government or the Zimbabwe government or many others, but they didn't. So now you got a big problem. But the good news about defaulting on the debt is that all the real wealth in the world, the fields and the factories and the houses and the buildings, the technologies, the mines, all that, it's still going to exist. The companies are still going to exist. They're just going to change ownership. And that's a good thing at this point, because the average guy in the US and Canada is pretty well screwed at this point. A controlled demolition is a good idea. I know people say, oh, that's ridiculous. I don't want to. Well, that's my suggestion. Take it or leave it. It won't happen, of course, because these people in government want to keep the ball rolling, kick the can down the road, so it's somebody else's problem further on down. That's what I suggest.